risk comes from not knowing what you're doing. And to me, that's a really good definition, at least it's a definition I like. It might not be, a real technical definition or something you're going to read in a CISSP handbook or something, but it explains what happens to me when I walk up to a craps table. That's what happened last night. I don't know what I'm doing. I have risk. And it's the same thing for a lot of organizations that try to do risk management. They don't know what they're doing, and they're introducing risk by not handling risk. And so today, let's talk a little bit about how we can raise the stakes in risk management and how we're handling, cybersecurity risk. And talk about a few, cool tools, a few things like Monte Carlo simulations, but really, my goal isn't to try to educate everyone on how, you should be handling risk or what you should be doing when it comes to risk. It's just really to get people thinking about how we have been handling risk and how we might be able to do things better. I'm sure a lot of you probably just were down listening to H.D. Moore and, kind of how he was talking about vulnerability management and how it hasn't really progressed in 20 years. And I feel like that's exactly where we are with risk management. In the last 20 years, we've been doing, the same thing we're doing today as we were then. So first, tell you a little bit about me and who I am. I'm Kyle Hinterberg. I'm a manager at LBMC. I live, just about 3.5 hours north of here, up in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. That's the Hodag. That's our claim to fame there. Up there with my family and my dogs. And if anyone's never seen the Hodag, that's, a great big green monster. It runs around in our woods up in Rhinelander. And it's also, it is our claim to fame. You wouldn't know this, but it exists in the Harry Potter universe. And it also has given us the best crossover ever because it's also a Scooby-Doo villain. And so this has informed me that Scooby-Doo exists within the Harry Potter universe. And that means that when Scooby-Doo is running around chasing all those monsters and chasing all those ghosts, it's real. When they're doing that, they're pulling off the masks, that was actually a ghost. It's all a cover-up. It's the Ministry of Magic. They have like a team following around Scooby-Doo and the gang, making sure that they never figure out that ghosts are real. But you probably don't want to hear about, Scooby-Doo conspiracy theories. So as far as me and, why I'm here, and kind of my qualifications to talk about risk, it's, I am not a risk expert. I do, work in risk. I work in cybersecurity. I've kind of sat on all sides of the table. I've been a sysadmin. I've worked in a security department for the last 6 or 7 years. I've been a cybersecurity consultant, and I've seen a lot of risk assessments. I've worked on risk assessments, and, really, I feel like my qualifications are I don't like what I see, and I don't like what, I end up working with. For the last number of years, I've been a PCI QSA, and for anyone who knows PCI, they all hate it. And for those of you who don't, it's the payment card industry. It's a set of rules that organizations need to follow in order to handle credit cards. I'm a QSA, a qualified security assessor, means I can assess organizations and how they're taking credit cards. One of the requirements organizations have had to do for years is to do a risk assessment. And so I come in and I ask an organization, hey, show me your risk assessment. And 9 times out of 10, I see something that looks just like this. It's just a bunch of boxes, and I always find it odd that out of all the hundreds of organizations, millions of organizations out there with all the millions and billions of risks that those organizations have, all of them can fit into one of 12 boxes. That's all we have. We have these 12 boxes. It's either red, it's orange, it's yellow, or it's green, and that describes all of our risks that we have in every single one of our organizations across the board. And to me, that just doesn't make sense. It doesn't, classify or qualify, what those risks are well enough. And even when we start looking at some of these terms, what's a catastrophic risk to you versus what's a critical risk? And even if you have those defined somewhere in a policy, is it something that makes sense to you as well as the teams who are implementing those controls that might be fixing it? And especially to the executives, if you present this to your executive boards, in my experience, mostly it's like, oh, we got too many reds. We need to get rid of some of those reds. Let's fix them. Or maybe you're working on the risk assessment. It's like, oh, we can't make all these reds. Let's, lower a few of those downs. We only want to really fix this 1 or 2 thing, so we'll just make those reds and make the rest oranges so no one really cares. And, another one is frequent. I don't really like that term because to me, frequent can mean a lot of things. Are we talking about how many emails we receive a day? 4, not frequent. Breaches, that's frequent. 4 a day, that's frequent. And that's another place where these qualifications don't really get to that granular level to really inform us about information. And if your organization is handling risk this way, you're not alone. If we just go right out to Google and we say, hey, show us a risk assessment chart. Hey, what's a risk assessment chart supposed to look like? And we type that in, we don't lead the witness, we don't tell it anything, we're going to get a million versions of the same thing. They all look exactly the same, and it's going to show us and tell us that if we're managing risk, we should worry about green, yellow, and red, because that's the way you manage risk. And I was thinking to myself, how long have we been doing this? Where did this originally come from? I totally get the whole stoplights, it makes sense in some cases, but when did this come about? And so I decided to do the least risky thing I could possibly do and ask ChatGPT, because everything it says is the God's truth, and I, for one, support our AI overlords. And so I went out and asked ChatGPT, how long have we been doing this? And it's told me we've been doing this since the 50s. So this method of analyzing risk and tracking risk has been out there, literally for 60, 70 years. And if you look, it's even the government's doing it. So it's the government's fault, and they're helping ChatGPT to, control us and make us do risk this way. And so that's where, really it's all a pet peeve of mine that I just feel like we could do better. And especially when we're managing, million and billion dollar, industries, why can't we manage our risk a little bit better? And before we dive into, some of the ideas I have there, first I wanted to cover one thing. If you notice the topic, the title was, a gambler's guide. And I realize a lot of people don't like the concept of gambling with risk or gambling with our organizations. But I think that's where, you need to look at the term in a different light. It's, sometimes equated badly, similar to the term hacker can be, thought of badly. And a lot of people think of this guy as a gambler. But he's sitting there at a slot machine pushing a button, and in my opinion, he's a loser. He has no chance of winning. He's just determining how slowly he loses his money. Whereas someone like this is Vanessa Selbst, one of the potentially, greatest poker players to have lived, has won millions of dollars playing poker. And she's a gambler, whereas he's a loser. And really the difference is he has the odds totally against him. Most of those slot machines, they pay out, somewhere 70 to 90%. It just means for every dollar you put in, you're only getting, maybe a 75 cents back. That's it. And that's just the way that game is going to play. That's the odds. And he's not making informed decisions. He's just clicking buttons, making random decisions, doing about as well as I am on the, slot machine on the badge. Whereas someone who's a real gambler, who really understands it, they play the odds. They make informed decisions. They understand the mechanics of the game. They can still lose. They can obviously still lose. The best poker player in the world can still lose. But they're making informed decisions, and more often than not, they're going to win and walk away a winner. And that's what we need to do with our organizations. We need to make informed decisions, and we need to gamble with our organizations. None of us, I'm assuming, work at a company that has infinite resources. Because if you do, let me know, I'll come work with you too. But, unless you have infinite resources, you need to make that gamble. Where are you going to put your time? Where are you going to put your money? And in doing that, you're gambling. You're not going to secure this area because you don't think it's going to be attacked, and you're gambling on that. And if it gets attacked, too bad for you. And that's where you need to, be a gambler, make informed decisions. And so to kind of keep that motif, let's raise the stakes. Let's think about some things we can do to enhance the risk management game and enhance what we're doing to really secure our organizations. And so, again, there's a million different ways you could, kind of skin this cat, and a million different things you could look at. And my goal is just to kind of whet your appetite, give you a few things to think about, maybe go back and, talk with your teams, figure out new ways that you can approach risk. But some of the ones that, I'll be talking about and covering today is the kind of the concept of a targeted risk analysis or risk assessment. Doing some human risk calibration, it kind of sounds, more high-tech and cybernetic than it really is. It's, really more learning how to make good decisions. The idea of quantitative versus qualitative, I feel like most organizations lean too far one way or the other, and really the right way to approach that is to do both, really. Both have their purposes and their uses, and you shouldn't just say, hey, quantitative's too hard, we're going to do all qualitative, or, qualitative is useless, we're going to do all quantitative. Use the right tool in the right circumstance. And lastly, we'll dabble a little bit with Monte Carlo simulations. If you, have heard a little bit about them, I feel like when I talk about them to people, most people think that that's something that, only the high-level risk wizards get to play with, but really it's an easy tool. It's something that you can, stand up in Excel in short order and, be running your own Monte Carlo simulations. It sounds, again, pretty cool, and it is pretty fun, but it's not as hard as what some people might have you believe. So first, the idea of a targeted risk assessment or a risk analysis, this is a concept actually that, again, in my current line of work with PCI work, it's something that has come about in a big way just recently. And that's because historically, and for the last several versions of the PCI DSS, we've been required to have organizations do an organization-wide annual risk assessment. And so that's been a requirement that has existed for, years and years. And again, that's where I come into an organization, they literally dust off their risk assessment, they say, oh, look at this, our risks haven't changed, we didn't do anything for the last year, here's your risk assessment. And I look at the requirements in the DSS, the data security standard, and it's very, kind of vague on what they need to do. I don't have enough to say, to fail you, essentially, so I have to accept this, outdated risk assessment. They slap a new date on it, they're good to go. And that's just kind of perpetuated this problem in the industry. Again, just listening to H.D. Moore talking about the problems that PCI has caused in the scan world, I think that it's a little bit, contributed to the problem in the risk assessment world. But at least here, I feel like they've fixed it. Just, back on the 31st, the end of last month, PCI version 3.2.1 was expired. It no longer is an acceptable way to attest to your compliance. And now PCI 4.0 has come about. And in 4.0, they've actually removed that requirement to have an organization-wide risk assessment. Not to say it's not potentially a good idea, but instead you now need to do targeted risk analyses. And so, again, to take it to my consulting, when I'm working with a client, they might ask me, hey, for this requirement, how often should we do this? How does this apply to our organization? How deep do we have to go with this control? And generally my answer is always, well, that's something that really should be driven by your risk assessment. But then they say, more or less, well, our risk assessment doesn't cover that, and that's the problem. And now that's exactly what DSS is trying to fix by requiring these targeted risk analyses. Essentially, there's now specific requirements that say, hey, you need to do this as often as your targeted risk analysis has determined. A great example, again in the PCI world is pin pads, where when you go to a store, you have to swipe your credit card. All the organizations that have those pin pads, they're required to look at those on some type of a periodic basis to make sure there's no skimming devices or anything going on with them. If those pin pads are, at a cashier's station where that cashier is always watching those pin pads, they always have access to it, maybe they only inspect them, once a week or once a month. And that's, totally okay given their risk potentially. But then you have gas stations. Gas stations have, pay at the pump, and they have pin pads out at the pump. Those aren't attended. People aren't really paying that much attention to them. You can go drive your big van and park there and do whatever you want. And so maybe you're checking those every 2 hours or every 4 hours. Those are the types of targeted risk analyses that organizations now need to do in order to comply with PCI. And that's exactly the kind of concept that we should take as far as all of our risks and all of our organizations, when we're looking at things. When you see a new vulnerability pop up, hey, we just got this scan, we have this new critical vulnerability. What do we do about this? You should do a targeted risk analysis. You should look at that vulnerability, determine, hey, does this apply to our organization? Are we vulnerable? If so, what mitigating strategies might we have in place? Can we have a firewall in front of the system? Do we already have a firewall? Do we have a WAF? Whatever it might be. Do an analysis and then enter that into your risk register. You should still track your risks, have a big risk register, know what's going on there, but have these targeted assessments to look at specific problems. Hey, we just heard from marketing that we're going to deploy this new website. Do a targeted risk assessment on that website. Determine what's going on, enter the data into your risk register, and keep going from there. Don't wait until, January 31st to go through your annual risk assessment and then pretend like you can know every single thing that's happened in the last 12 months and that none of those risks are going to change in the next 12 months. So the next, kind of concept and idea to play around with is human risk calibration. And really you can see here, it's that the idea behind it is training individuals to predict outcomes at a specified confidence interval or confidence level, generally around 90%. And, again, not trying to be able to always make the right decision, but just be able to get your decision to be made within basically a range. So if I ask you a question and you don't know the answer, that's perfectly fine, and you shouldn't be able to necessarily say the answer to that question, but you likely can provide a range and say, oh, that's, probably somewhere between, A and B, essentially. And you have a 90% confidence that that's where that answer lies. And there's still that 5% that maybe it's, to the left of A or to the right of B. That's the idea of risk calibration, or human risk calibration. Kind of decision calibration is another way to think about it. And this is something where you can actually go through exercises. If you go out to Google and say, hey, tell me about risk calibration or decision calibration, you can go through a session to help yourself improve on how to do this. You can go out and buy training that just specifically does this. All it does is teach you how to make better decisions, something you can do and use throughout your life. And really what these look like, we can walk through a few of them. They're not always about, and they don't need to be and shouldn't be about, like security or risk specifically. It's something like, how many sovereign rulers has England had in the past 1,000 years? And so the idea is to teach yourself how to think about problems like this and say, okay, 1,000 years, if that means if there was one every 50 years, maybe there was 50 of them, or 100 of them, and kind of working through the math associated to it until you get to a point and say, well, hey, maybe I'm thinking about this, and a ruler could maybe go for 20 years, or maybe they could go for 70 years. I'm 90% sure that that number probably falls somewhere between 30 and 60. That's the kind of goal and the process that you should be working through, and getting to a point where you're 90% sure that the number is going to fall within there, and not worrying about the extreme outliers, because specifically in cybersecurity, that's where we really fall down. No one ever wants to give a solid number because they're always afraid that Murphy's Law is going to hit, and whatever you say is going to be wrong. But you have to accept that, and the people that you're working with have to accept that, and you have to work within that confidence level of, hey, I'm 90% sure this is where it's going to fall. And so in this case, maybe we say somewhere between 30 and 60, and we look, oh, it's 47. That was right within there. We're perfect. That was a good answer. And obviously we could do better, and maybe if we understood England a little bit better, we could say the number was going to fall between 45 and 55. But even saying 30 to 60, that still hits us at that correct confidence level, and we can use that information to make informed decisions. So we can look at another one. If you were to jump straight up in the air 50 feet, how long would it take before you fell down? Anyone have an idea? What's a lower bound that we could put on that? If you jumped up 50 feet in the air, how long would it take before you hit the ground?
6 seconds.
Okay. Does that sound good? Anyone against the idea of 6 seconds to jump up? Anyone have think it's going to be less or more? Does that sound about right? 2? So maybe we take that. If we say 2 is kind of our lower bound and 6 is our upper bound, and say, hey, more than likely, just based on how far we're going to, jump up, that, between 2 and 6 seconds, we're 90% confident maybe gravity is way faster than we think and it's only going to take us a second, or maybe we're on the moon and it's going to take us longer, but we can look and it's 3.5 seconds. So it was right within that, that interval that we determined, between 2 and 6 seconds, 3.5, we're right on the money. One that probably a second grader could answer better than most of us is how many gallons are in a bushel. Anyone have a clue how many gallons? I can think of like a bushel basket, but I literally have never measured by bushels. So does anyone have a guess how many gallons would be in a bushel?
40.
4 or 40? So that's a pretty wide range, and you might think that's useless, but it isn't. That's a perfect example of trying to determine, hey, we don't know this, so we're going to give ourselves a wide range. We're 90% sure, and we can look, and it's 8. So, we were right within there. We weren't perfect, 4 to 40, but it was 8. We still had a correct answer. We were able to give ourselves useful information. And now we can take this and spin it over into, IT and cybersecurity and say, how long is it going to take to restore that production database? If that database goes down, how long is it going to take to come back up? Normally, if you ask, any of your DBs right now and say, hey, Mr. DBA, if you're going to restore this system, how long is it going to take? Probably they're going to get kind of flustered, not want to answer that question, and they're going to give you either a much shorter or much longer estimate than what is really possible. Either they're afraid they're going to be fired if they say what's really real, and they're going to say, oh, we can do that in 2 minutes, or they're going to be worried that it's never going to come back up and say it's going to take a week. But that isn't useful information. If they were educated on how to do this, risk-based decision making, they could say, we've ran some tests. The best we've come out at is, maybe 2 hours. But we do know that sometimes, if we haven't run backups recently, it might take a little bit longer to get that data up to where it should be. And so maybe it's 6. And so they can say, this is going to take 2 to 6 hours. And again, that's only a 90% confidence level. You, as working through this risk, can understand that there's still a 5% chance that it could take much longer than that, or up to a 10%, depending on where their confidence falls. And if it takes 2 days to come back up, that's not that it was wrong. It was just that their confidence of that 90% wasn't maybe quite as good as it could have been. Or this is one that is probably a pretty high percentage. What's the likelihood of one of your users clicking on a phishing email on any given week? Clicking on that link. And it's going to depend a lot on how many users you have. But you can think about it and say, on any given week, there's probably, maybe a 25 to 50% chance of a user clicking on a phishing email. And that will then give you, more of that basis of how to work forwards. And maybe you say that number's too high, where you need to implement some training and knock that down to a 10 to 20%. Or maybe we need to put in some, phishing controls. These are the types of ways that you can work through and calibrate your decisions, so that way when you're making risk-based decisions, you're using solid, useful numbers. And now, talking about numbers, that gets us right into, again, that concept between qualitative and quantitative. To me, I hate the fact that they're like almost the same word, and they're, both look and sound a lot alike. But basically, qualitative risk is where you're talking about non-numerical terms. Essentially, you're using categories, something like red, yellow, green, high, medium, low. Whereas quantitative is talking about a quantity of something. You're really using numbers. That tends to be what quantitative risk gets down to. And both of these totally have their places. Tends to be, in my opinion, qualitative is where you don't need quite as much accuracy. You just need a high-level look. You need to have more of that stoplight approach, red, yellow, green. Whereas quantitative is where, you really need to dig into it and understand those numbers. To me, if I'm an executive, I want to know this is a $2 million risk, that I could lose $2 million if I take this risk, versus this is a severe risk. Saying it's a severe risk doesn't mean a lot to me compared to what $2 million means to me. To kind of help us talk through it, we can think about the risk involved in having a house, get hit by a hurricane. Maybe you're looking around across the nation and you say, hey, I want to buy a house on a coast, but I want to make sure that my house isn't going to get knocked down by a hurricane, and I have these 50 options that I'm going to work through. In a case like that, using qualitative risk might very well be good. You look at these 50 locations, you determine which ones are, more likely or less likely to get hit by a bad hurricane, and then you figure out what the, the likelihood is, kind of that severity and likelihood. And, in this case, we have this house living right literally on the edge of a cliff. We might say it's in a critical area. If it gets hit, it's probably going to get demolished. The likelihood is remote, so it's not as likely, but that gives us a serious risk. And if we did that for all 50 houses, we'd be able to have that, spread across that 12 by, 4 by 4 grid in those 12 squares, and see which ones are red and which ones are green. And maybe we want to move forward with the ones that are more in the green-yellow range, ones that are, less likely to get destroyed. And so that's where we can then bring in the idea of quantitative risk. This is again where we have real numbers and something that's going to really make sense to us. And say, hey, the probability of this house getting hit by a hurricane, we've looked at the past 100 years of weather in this area, and it has an 8% chance of getting hit by a hurricane. And then we say, when hurricanes in this area have hit houses, based on the value of the house, it looks like for the damage, it'll likely fall somewhere between $10,000 and $50,000. Maybe more often than not, it's just roof damage, that's it, 10 to 50 will take care of it. Obviously, we, thinking about that, what we just talked through for, kind of that confidence level, there's always the chance the whole house is going to get knocked down, but that's, kind of that far out chance, generally it's going to be $10,000 to $50,000 worth of damage. This is the type of risk analysis we'd likely want to do when we had narrowed down our houses to, maybe a handful of options to figure out, is that something I'm okay with? Am I okay with living in a house that has a 8% chance of getting hit by a hurricane on any given year? To me, that's a lot more informative than saying there's a, remote probability of a critical severity. And if I'm going to an executive, I don't want to say, hey, we have this issue with our firewall. It's going to create a remote probability of a critical security flaw. As an executive, that's probably going to just sound like a bunch of gobbledygook. But if you go to an executive and say, hey, we have this vulnerability, it gives us a 20% likelihood that in the next month we are going to get hit by, some type of a vulnerability exposure that could cause us $50,000 to $75,000 worth of damage. That's the type of information that an executive can say, hey, okay, I get that. That's within our risk appetite. We can deal with that. Or hey, that's way more than we can afford to spend. What can we do to fix that? And so now to take it to the next level, this is where we can start dabbling in some more tools like a Monte Carlo simulation. And how many people here have heard of or used a Monte Carlo simulation? So we have a few, but basically it's a way to create, kind of information for kind of inherently complex, problematic random systems. And the concept came about way back in the 40s. Essentially, there was a guy, Stanislaw Ulam, he got sick. He was a mathematician who got sick, and he was laying around playing solitaire because that was before the iPhone was invented. And so he's playing solitaire, and like a mathematician would, he starts to think, hey, I'm playing all these hands of solitaire. What could I do to kind of determine all the outcomes of this hand? If I draw these certain cards, what are all the different ways this game of solitaire could work out? And so he starts thinking about how to mathematically determine all those outcomes. And then he starts talking with one of his colleagues, John von Neumann, and the two of them, continue to work on this idea of how to mathematically determine, kind of random behaviors of different sets of information. And then the name Monte Carlo simulation, that came about by a third gentleman, Nicholas Metropolis. That's really, his claim to fame, I guess, is he dubbed this simulation, this style of working through a problem, a Monte Carlo simulation, really just based on the fact that it had to deal with, kind of randomness, kind of the gambling aspect of it, and it kind of helped that it was created by, playing cards, working through the idea of how to determine a hand of solitaire. But again, it's a simulation for a computational technique that uses random sampling to simulate complex systems, helping predict the probability of various outcomes in situations with inherent uncertainty. It sounds like a mouthful, but maybe you're thinking like, hey, these guys, their names kind of sound a little familiar. What would they have been working on back in the 1940s for, a situation with inherent uncertainty? I might have just watched a movie about that last year. Not that one. It was back in the days of the Manhattan Project is actually where the idea for Monte Carlo simulations came out. If anyone, and I'm guessing most people have probably seen Oppenheimer, and if you remember, and this isn't a spoiler because it's history, but when they were talking about the fact that they ran the numbers and there was a chance that when they tested the first nuke that it might light the atmosphere on fire, that was essentially them talking about them working through the probabilities of Monte Carlo simulations and determining, hey, when we light off this nuke, what is going to happen? What are all of the potential outcomes? Hundreds or thousands of outcomes, how everything could slightly sway or change that probable or possible outcome. That's what they were doing. They were running Monte Carlo simulations, and some of those, based on the math and the understanding of science they had at the time, caused them to believe that it might light the atmosphere on fire and destroy the world when they had that first nuke go off. And luckily it didn't, or maybe we're all living in a simulation. But so you can kind of think about this. This is the way it works, is showing all the different paths through possible outcomes. You take some inputs, you say, hey, here are my inputs, here's my amount of randomness that could happen, and the Monte Carlo simulations will play out all the possible outcomes. And again, if you're thinking about this and you say, hey, that sounds kind of familiar, maybe I've seen another movie where, they had Monte Carlo simulations used in popular culture, and you'd be right. Just a few years ago when, Dr. Strange was working through all of those different possible outcomes of how to defeat Thanos, he was effectively doing Monte Carlo simulations. He was working through 14 million different outcomes and determining which way they would win. That was essentially working through that. That's kind of the concept of a Monte Carlo simulation. And so, if both the Sorcerer Supreme and, nuclear physicists leverage these tools, it might be something that we should take a look at as well. And I thought about trying to walk through, really how to build your own, but it would be too much of a really bad eye chart. Trying to have slides that talk through Excel files suck. And so my big recommendation, and we will touch on it some, but is to go out and get this book. If you have never read it, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk, I feel like it is an absolute must-have for any person working in any cybersecurity field. There's another book that Douglas Hubbard also wrote before this, How to Measure Anything. I would also recommend that. Read both of them. They are both excellent books, a lot of information. A lot of what we're talking about today comes directly out of this book. So take the time, read that. It's going to teach you more than I ever could about Monte Carlo simulations. But even better than that is if you see that URL down at the bottom, that's where they have provided all the materials that are referenced in the book for free. So you can go download and play with Excel files directly from their website and run your own Monte Carlo simulations. And so we can see exactly what those Monte Carlo simulations are going to look like. This is their tool. Again, if you go to that URL, and if anyone didn't get it or wants it, feel free to reach out to me. I can send that right over to you. But essentially here you'll see that, over on the side there's all those risks listed out. We have some risk names. And then the probability of a loss over the course of a year. And so, basically have taken those, that risk calibration, went through and used that to determine what our 90% confidence level is in any issues happening here, and said, for ransomware, we got a 10% confidence that that's going to happen, potentially within the next year. And then similarly, we have that lower and upper bound for how much it might cost us. So essentially, this is saying on any given year, we have a 10% chance of losing $2 to $16 million due to a ransomware incident. And that's all well and good, but just that information alone isn't necessarily that useful to us. If we get over, we can see that expected inherent loss. Basically, that's doing a mathematical function, not exactly an average, but figuring out, based on the 10% and the likelihood of the 2 to 16 million on any given year, what you should more or less be expecting to lose if you went, through a number of years. But the interesting part, the power really of a Monte Carlo simulation is in the simulated inherent loss. That is, essentially, again, thinking about Dr. Strange when he went through all those 14 million outcomes, that is one of them. And so we can, in this tool, you can basically have Excel run as many instances as you'd want. And so we can click ahead and say, hey, this year, we had just that 2.5 million loss due to cloud compromise. Let's see what happens in another year. Oh, that year was a little bit worse. We lost, about 3 million due to cloud compromise and about 2.5 due to SaaS compromise. And we can advance again and say, oh, that year we really lucked out. Some years we have no problems at all. And then we can run it again. Oh, that year was a little bit worse. We lost 150,000 up above, and then a couple down below for almost another $3.5 million. And again, this is all well and good, but it's not maybe that useful, to look at what we would potentially have happen to us in one given year. And you can't go to your executives and say, well, I ran the numbers and there's some random amount of chance that maybe next year we'll have $3.5 million worth of losses. That's not useful to anyone. But what you can do with a Monte Carlo simulation is run this 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times and then take the averages from that. And that's what we have here, is basically that same sheet, ran that 1,000 times, and these are the outcomes. And so now we can see that based on running through 1,000 years of what we currently know to be true, we have a 40% chance of losing, that's in thousands, so basically, millions of dollars still. But we can see that 40% chance and how it drops off. And then we can see that right here, based on up here, this is basically where we've set our risk appetite. We've determined up here that we, expect to lose $100,000 a year. We have a lot of money, so we're okay with that. And, we have a 99% chance of losing that. We're okay right there. But as we work through it, we can see for $10 million, we don't want to have a risk of losing $10 million that's more than 2%. That's what that's set, and that's essentially created this dotted line. That shows our risk tolerance levels. And so we want to have this red line at or below that blue line to make it so that way we are accepting the risk, that we are choosing to accept and not introducing more risk. Right now, our environment, based on these numbers, has more risk than what we want to have included in it. And we can even see right down here, it's set. $10 million is currently at a 4.8% chance. That's where we ran through these numbers 1,000 times. Out of 1,000 times, we have a 4.8% chance of having more than a $10 million loss. If we wanted to fix that, that's where we'd have to go back. Maybe we go on ransomware if that's our big issue, and we implement better EDR protections, install some new tools that are going to be able to better detect malware, and maybe we can drop some of these numbers. Now we say, if we get hit by ransomware, we have the capability to encapsulate it a little bit better, segment portions of our network. It's only going to be a $2 to $8 million loss. Maybe the probability in a year we can drop that to a 5%, which would then allow us, when we run the simulation again, run through 1,000 instances, maybe we can drop that $10 million to below 2% and have that level of risk acceptance that we're okay with. And again, this is the type of information that if I was a CEO of an organization, I would want to see this. I don't want to see reds and greens and yellows. That's okay for little risks and little, helping make some decisions. But if I want to determine if I should spend $1 million on a new tool, I want to be able to see specifically how that's going to affect us. If I put this $1 million into this tool, is it going to drop my risk levels, or is it not really going to affect those numbers? This is the type of tools and the type of risk determinations that we need to have and we need to present to our executives if we really want to have actionable data. And that's right there the problem in a nutshell. Is I feel like all too often when we're presenting these risk assessments to our executives, or for myself talking with clients, they see these different things, reds, greens, yellows, whatevers. But it isn't really that actionable. There isn't a way that we can see how it's actually going to move from a red to an orange. Whereas when we have data like this, we can make decisions and make determinations to literally drop those numbers and see how it is going to affect us. And so, to me, it really gets down to the biggest problem we have in security and in any organization. And as a consultant, it's like the worst thing I can ever hear. I absolutely hate it when I ask a question, why do you do it like that? Oh, we do it that way because that's how we've always done it. That's what I feel like where we're at a lot of times in risk management. Again, not talking about H.D. Moore, he was just saying that for vulnerability management. This is the way we do it because it's the way we've always done it. And that's the absolute worst reason to do anything. If you look at a process and you determine, yeah, this makes sense, this is the way we should do it, that's fine. But more often than not, if you take a second look, you can probably figure out a better way to do it. And so that's what I think we need to do when it comes to risk management. We need to look at doing more targeted approaches, looking at specific vulnerabilities, specific instances of a problem, and how to determine to fix that, put that into your risk register and go from there. We have to determine how to calibrate ourselves and the teams we're working with to make good decisions. Don't just make, off-the-wall decisions or always go with the Murphy's Law approach of the absolute worst thing that could ever happen. Make informed decisions. Still you're going to be gambling a little bit, but make an informed decision of what is actually likely to happen. What outcome is probable based on what you know. And try to, balance out that use of qualitative and quantitative. In my opinion, kind of like the picture there shows, numbers are always going to be, weighted a little bit heavier than just categories. But categories still have their places. When you get a vulnerability scan report with 1 million vulnerabilities, you're going to start out with reds, yellows, and greens because that's just the way that works. You don't have time to necessarily do a risk assessment on every single one of those. But all those reds, you should take that second look, go through a CVSS calculation and determine what is the actual risk to you. Is it a critical to you, or is it, internal and behind 14 firewalls and it's, not that big of a deal? Take the time and effort to do that and don't just fix things based on random, randomish categories. And lastly, don't be afraid to get your hands a little bit dirty with some of the tools that exist out there, like Monte Carlo simulations. Again, that's not the things that are designed for risk wizards, if risk wizards exist. It's tools that we can all use and implement. You can go out right now and in an afternoon build yourself a Monte Carlo simulation. Maybe you want to say, there's 25 different ways for me to get to work. Which way is the best? You could build out a Monte Carlo simulation that'll work you through something like that. Kind of anything that has some amount of randomness in it, you could simulate out and determine what the different outcomes might be. And start playing with the tool and then start using it in how you're determining your risk for your organization. Again, thinking back, if you can determine the outcomes based on 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years, that gives you hard data that you can then go to an executive and say, this is why we need to fix this. Not because it's red, but because it has a 10% chance of costing us $10 million. And so with that, I know we still have a little bit of time. If anyone has any questions, I'll try to answer them. Though again, I can't say I'm an expert in anything, so I might not be able to answer them.
You're an expert in PCI. Question, and that is, of the clients that you've gone to see, how many security teams have you seen that have someone with a statistical or actual science background?
Just so everyone can hear, the question is for all the clients I work through, how many actually had like a statistical or science background for doing risk assessments, I'm assuming, more or less. And the answer is, I can think of none off the top of my head. I feel like more often than not, when it comes to organizations, the risk assessments get handed off to security. And just because you're in security does not mean you have a statistical background. And that's a problem, I would say. Getting more data science people working in handling risk assessments would be, a great first step.
So just from a different perspective for a moment, I think when you see internal auditors doing risk assessments, we find that that's a little higher. I have seen them with statistical backgrounds. When you're looking at just your straight cybersecurity experts, though, or team, I don't think I've ever seen that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just so everyone else can hear it, is the point is that for internal auditors working on things, there's a good chance that they might have more of that statistical background. But again, cybersecurity professionals tend not to. I feel like a lot of us in cybersecurity didn't want to do audit, and that's where we got out of that whole number side of the game. But when it comes to certain things like risk assessments, getting someone who has more of an audit background, a statistical background, that's really going to help you out, get those solid numbers. Otherwise, again, we're just saying red, green, orange. Any other?
Excuse me, yeah, so like the example you gave with the time machines, which is real world, there's a lot of those use cases out there. In order to convey information, often the red, green, yellow is the way to go to kind of prime the pump. And then what do you use to follow up to actually get action?
I would say it depends. It's really dependent on your audience. And I think that that's a really important thing to take into consideration is, if you're doing something that's more of a high level and you're not expecting, the people that you're presenting to understand or really put a lot of time, then sometimes, yeah, the stoplight, red is go, green is good, type of approach is all you can expect from them. But the problem I see is taking that too far. And so, like, in my opinion, if you're presenting to your board, you might have red and green, but you should really right away follow that up with what those numbers mean and what you have used to make that determination of what is red versus what is green. Because while you might want to have that, that visual representation so that way you can quickly see that, you need to have some numbers behind the scene to tie it back to. Otherwise, I feel like it just does not have the hit to it, to help carry that. Does that help make sense? But I think that, really that's the key point is whenever you're doing a risk assessment, you need to take into consideration who the audience is that's going to be seeing that report or whatever you're providing out.
So cybersecurity insurance's premiums have been skyrocketing, and these are the people that do many of the Monte Carlo, Poisson distribution, so on and so forth. Are they right in terms of how much they've increased and our risk?
I would tend to say probably not. I feel like what has happened in the insurance industry, and just so everyone can hear, is really, you know, that the fact that cyber insurance has really blown up in the last year or two, and, you know, premiums for using cyber insurance are way extreme versus what they were originally. And my personal gut feeling is that it's just a reaction to the fact that you have all of the, you know, big cases that are finally now getting handled, and they still don't have a grasp on what cyber risk really is. And I feel like that's a case where we need to have more cyber people working with the audit side. You know, that's where internally, you know, when we have our cyber team, we need to have help from audit to be able to do these statistical models. On the flip side, I feel like too often right now insurance agencies don't have those cyber folks to really explain what a risk or a threat is, and they're just looking at, you know, more of the numbers. And right now, they're afraid that they're going to be, you know, insuring the company that has the next $1 billion loss. And so they're just, you know, charging an arm and a leg for it.
This may be off topic, but based on what you just shared, do cyber insurance companies give you a break on the premium if you can demonstrate a working information security management system in place, if you are certified to ISO 27001, something like that?
Generally, they do. I wouldn't maybe say necessarily a break, but most cyber risk insurance agencies nowadays are requiring you to essentially meet some minimal standard of security, that you need to go through some process, either their own process, or present them with, you know, that you've gone through ISO or a SOC audit or whatever it might be, that they are going to require that. And otherwise they, you know, potentially just won't insure you, or you're going to have, you know, super high premiums if you just kind of say we have Wild West security going on.
This is excellent, Kyle. When we look at that line and we say they're at 4.8, that's outside of our risk tolerance, our risk appetite. We need that to drop down. Do you know of any frameworks or anything that, when you apply this control, how it should impact that risk? Like we can give our 90% probability, you know, guesstimate, but I'm just wondering if there's any frameworks that kind of have systematized that at all.
Sure, and just for everyone to hear that, and I, you know, basically when we're talking about how we could, you know, systematize using a framework essentially to help us determine how to drop the numbers, you know, like when we were looking at that last chart and it showed that, you know, we were, you know, 2.8% above what our goal for, you know, risk appetite was, what we could use to drop that and, you know, essentially leverage a framework. And I think that's where, you know, potentially something like the FAIR framework or something could come into play for helping you analyze and assess your risk. I know that's really heavy on the quantitative side, which is what that's covering. But generally speaking, it's just really going to, I guess, be up to any frameworks that your organization is using. Any other questions? If not, I thank you all very much. You know, definitely feel free to hit me up if you want to talk about better ways to handle risk or PCI. Thank you very much.